Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. Star Trek helped shape the concept of fandom. Sure, fandom was a thing before Trek started with fans of Sherlock Holmes, but a lot of modern fandom concepts came from Star Trek. The fan convention, while obviously happening prior to Trek, really took off in 1972, when the first Star Trek convention was held. I won't go into too much detail. Check out the Trekkies documentary if you want a more detailed, if a little misleading account. The point I'm making is trying to lead into fan fiction, which Star Trek inspired a lot of. Seriously, the entire modern idea of fan fiction came from Star Trek, where it was published by mainly female fans through magazines, since, well, the internet didn't exist yet. Star Trek fan fiction even gave us the Mary Sue concept, which has since taken on a life of its own. Another thing Star Trek fanfiction gave us was slashfiction. I'm gonna preface this by saying I'm not a fan of slashfiction. It just doesn't appeal to me. But I can't deny that what was started by Trek fans spread to basically all media. There's slashfiction for everything nowadays, and it started with Kirk and Spock. So why am I giving this fandom lecture? That backstory is necessary to talk about today's book, Star Trek Killing Time. This book, written by Della Van Hees, is about the Romulans traveling back in time to alter the Federation's history so that they won't be pushed back by Starfleet, and in turn, create a universe where Spock is the captain of the VSS Shikar, and Kirk is a lowly ensign. The book features a lot of romantic and sexual overtones, which were marked for removal in the original manuscript. But due to various circumstances, the changes were never made, and the book was published, including them. After a letter was sent to Gene Roddenberry's assistant, the books were recalled and edited to remove the offending material, and it was reprinted. However, Pocket Books, the publisher, had already sent out 100,000 to 150,000 copies to retailers, and fans began buying them up, as they were expected to become collector's items. I found out about this book around the same time I discovered Engines of Destiny, and if there's one thing I love about Star Trek, it's time travel and alternate timelines. So I tracked a copy down, and after some research, my copy is not a second printing as I had expected. I am in possession of the original, unedited version. So I bet you're wondering, are the romantic and sexual overtones really that bad? No, it's pretty harmless stuff. Honestly, what was worse was my anticipation that something X-rated was going to happen, and then nothing. I don't know if sensibilities have changed or something, but what happens in this book is pretty tame. I think Kirk and Spock hold hands at one point, but that's as far as it goes. Sorry if you were expecting it to be the likes of Rated X internet fanfic. Anyway, I've been talking for a while, so let's get straight into the book. The cover is gorgeous. I have a love of these old Star Trek book covers because unlike today where the covers are mainly made by using stock photos and CGI stuff, these covers look like paintings. And while some covers, like the entropy effects, look kinda crappy, this one is amazing. We've got Spock in what I guess is the alternate Starfleet uniform. That looks more like the Romulan Republic uniforms from Star Trek Online, and two women in the background, dressed like Roman noblewomen. And the one in the foreground kinda looks like Flavia from the Rome story arc in MST3K. Maybe that means that Blast Hard Cheese will be in this. There's also a Romulan warbird in the direct middle of the page, flying over a green-shrouded city, where I assume there is a wizard behind a curtain. We've got the title and the tagline, Enter Second History and a Galaxy Gone Mad. I really hope this second history wipes Before Dishonor out of existence. Anyway, let's get to the book. The story opens up with Captain James T. Kirk waking up after having a very restless night, having dreamed very disturbing dreams, where Spock was captain and he was an ensign. Which is ridiculous. You can't just take command and demote the previous captain, unless you're Kirk and the previous captain is Will Decker, but whatever. He confides his worries in Spock, who rightly suggests that he sees Dr. McCoy about it. Kirk isn't in the mood for psychoanalysis, so he invites Spock to join him for breakfast. On the bridge, Lieutenant Jeremy Richardson is complaining about his love life, or lack thereof, to Sulu and Uhura, as Kirk and Spock talk some more and they realize that their dreams were very similar and decide to check in with the good doctor. However, they're interrupted by Uhura getting a transmission that Kirk himself has to translate onto paper, because classified or something, and he goes to do that, being very distressed by the message. Jerry starts befriending Yeoman Saparva, a Catellan, which is a quadruped species, which is good for her, as being the only quadruped on the ship was getting pretty lonely for her. She mentions that the psych lab where she's assigned was getting some odd complaints that normally crop up during boring assignments, like the one the Enterprise is currently assigned to, and Jerry asks about odd dreams, which concerns Saparva, as that was the 14th complaint about dreams that day. Spock beats Kirk at chess, and they take a walk in a sort of proto-holodeck, which is a garden on board the ship with hiking trails and the like, a very romantic place to have a date. Kirk tells Spock the message he got, which told of Romulan activity at the edge of the neutral zone. However, they don't know what the Romulans are up to there. Kirk finally goes to McCoy, who tells Kirk that the dreams are probably nothing, but Kirk isn't so sure and tells McCoy that Spock had the exact same dream, which makes McCoy want to investigate it further. Kirk goes to sleep and dreams again, but when he wakes up, something isn't quite right. Kirk isn't captain, but an ensign, suffering from the after effects of something called the Talos device after having allegedly killed a Vulcan instructor at the Academy, and as a result is a drug addict, injecting a drug into himself after he wakes up. Meanwhile, Captain Spock of the VSS Shikar patrols the corridors, going to check on Chief Engineer Scott in engineering. However, when he gets there, he feels faint and notices strange things, like the air being earth-thick instead of thinner Vulcan air, and the normally Vulcan symbols on the wall turning into English. Spock starts to feel odd, coming down with symptoms that are consistent with blood fever, seeing a man in his dreams that he feels a connection with, though he doesn't know the man. Scott asks if he's okay, and Spock says that he's fine and goes about his business. Things aren't quite as good for Ensign Kirk, getting into a fight with his roommate Donner. Kirk gets into several fights actually, and doesn't show up to his duty shifts, getting a message to meet with the captain, which he doesn't do. In engineering, Lieutenant Commander Scott discovers that one of his engineers has sabotaged the matter-antimatter pods, and tells Captain Spock to turn off all non-essential power, and where to find the suspect. As Scotty finds the problem, Spock is strangely drawn to the science station and goes to sickbay to meet with Scott and the other engineers on duty during the incident. Nurse Chapel tells Spock about crew members having hallucinations, and Dr. McCoy realizes that Riker, the saboteur, is suffering from two distinct brainwave patterns, and as they do, Spock receives orders from Fleet Command for wartime preparation that would likely destroy the Shikar if it had to go into battle. Saparva spars with Nurse Chapel, and they both start suffering from odd feelings, as if something isn't quite right, and Chapel even incorrectly refers to Spock as First Officer. McCoy and Spock realize that insanity isn't only inflicting members of their crew, but all of Fleet Command, and they set out to discover the reason for why. Meanwhile, on the Romulan vessel Raven, Commander Tazel informs his wife about the Praetor's plans to travel back in time and directly alter the course of the Federation's history to weaken it and strengthen Romulus, starting with the destruction of the USS Kelvin. Just kidding. That story is for another show. Sorella, his wife, tells him how she's not too sure that time travel is the answer, as an earlier test to make a world more susceptible to Romulan ruling led to it being ravaged and destroyed. Tazel is optimistic, though, because the Praetor says it will work, though he does wonder who exactly the Praetor is, as he's never met them. Spock finally meets with Kirk and realizes that Kirk is the man he's been seeing in his dreams, though Kirk doesn't recognize him. He talks about Kirk's disciplinary problems, as he had been drafted for punishment for crimes on Earth. Spock confides in Kirk about the strange happenings, as he believes Kirk may be involved. Spock transfers Kirk's quarters, which angers Kirk, as it means that Donner will have more fodder to taunt him with. McCoy scans the entire crew's minds, finding the same thing in many. Altered versions of the Shikar, a different golden-haired captain, etc., etc. Tazzle looks over the differences between first and second history, and unfortunately for the Romulans, the Federation isn't all that different, since the Vulcans just took point on creating a coalition instead of Starfleet. Starfleet is half its normal size, but the Romulans aren't the superpower they'd hoped to be. Now, since this was written years prior to First Contact, the beginnings of Earth's foray into interstellar travel is a bit different. This version states that a Dr. Palmer had been contacting alien civilizations, and the Romulans made him disappear, causing Earth to not get involved in warp travel as quickly. Then, years after, the Vulcans showed up and saved the Earth when its resources began to dwindle. Which wipes Archer out of existence, so this timeline isn't so bad. As for the Romulans, they're basically back to square one, and Sorella wants to just give up, but Tazzle is obsessed with attacking the Alliance. Then, the Praetor requests to see Tazzle and Sorella. McCoy meets with Spock and states that his hypothesis is that what is occurring is similar to their interactions with the Tholians and the Terran Empire, letting us know that the Shikar had been assigned many of the same missions as the Enterprise. And Spock postulates that the reasoning for the weird mind readings is that their counterparts in whatever alternate reality they're interacting with no longer exist, so they only exist as faint rumblings in the back of their minds, and is causing the insanity exhibited by Riker and the Admiral. Though there are some people whose mind scans showed nothing, which means that they had died in the original timeline, and Spock and McCoy wrestle with possibly condemning those people to a death that doesn't have to happen, similar to Tasha Yar in yesterday's Enterprise. It would be most logical to stay tuned after these messages. And we're back. You made a most logical choice. McCoy also tells Spock that Kirk hasn't been in his quarters, as reported by his new roommate Jerry Richardson, and that he stumbled into sickbay demanding a drug that suppresses dreams, and when McCoy examined him, he found a whole host of problems stemming from the Talos device. Spock invites Kirk on the away mission to Canis 4, and Kirk finally meets his roommate. Richardson talks about the odd goings-on, and how he had unintentionally walked up to the bridge, sat at the helm, and started joking around with Sulu, despite the fact that he's a science officer and not a helmsman. Richardson also gives Kirk one of his blue Science Division shirts, since according to Richardson, officers who wear red shirts don't tend to live very long, a humorous nod to the red shirt phenomenon. The landing party, which includes Spock, McCoy, Kirk, and Donner, three main characters and a red shirt, beams down and they are suddenly attacked and Donner killed. Sorella meets with the Praetor, revealing that the Praetor is a woman, and the Romulan captain from the Enterprise incident, who got her cloaking device stolen by Kirk and Spock, so she has a bit of a personal stake in this. She realizes that eventually the Vulcans are going to realize that history was altered and attempt to change it back, and the Praetor wants to attempt to make peace with the Alliance so that if time is altered again, certain aspects of second history will remain. She says that they have to go after the VSS Shikar, since its first history counterpart, the Enterprise, had two devious officers on board that could help them. Not willingly, of course. The Praetor says that they merely need to kidnap one of them, and the other one will immediately do whatever it takes to get them back, and that the ship will help any ship in need, even a Romulan vessel. Spock wakes up in sickbay, and McCoy fills him in on what happened. The entire Canis thing was a setup. There never was a Canusian ambassador, and the Admiral denies ever sending them there in the first place, giving them more credence to their theory that the Admiral is nuts. Saparva and Richardson try an experiment of their own, trying to get into Richardson's mind to see his alternate counterpart. They do, though Jerry doesn't want to leave, since he's a lieutenant on the best ship in the fleet, but Saparva brings him back, with Jerry shouting for Captain Kirk when he awakens. They take their results to Dr. McCoy, and he calls in Spock, telling him it involved Ensign Kirk. Spock finds Kirk asleep in the garden, and after they argue a bit about why Spock saved him instead of Donner on Canis 4, Spock initiates a mind meld on Kirk, and Kirk sees Edith Keeler, Miramani, Dila, Ruth, and Reyna, before getting a vision of Admiral Comac giving him the Enterprise for a 5-year mission. Kirk reawakens and Spock apologizes for the forced mind meld, but Kirk is fine with it, because it gives him something to live for, knowing that he has a whole other life to get back. Spock wants to check on the Admiral, but they're too far away, and so contacts the VSS Teruta to request that they go back and check since they're closer. Spock sends Kirk to sickbay to hear what McCoy has to tell them, and Spock goes to the bridge to talk with the captain of the Teruta, a familiar face to Trek fans, as it's Captain Christopher Pike, former first officer of the Shikar. So that's definitely one person in this new reality who has it better, considering that in the regular universe, Pike is living on Talos 4 because his body is so damaged that if he wasn't on Talos 4, he has to use a wheelchair and only communicate through beeps. And in the Mirror and Kelvin universes, he's dead. So Second History turned out pretty damn well for Pike. Spock tells Pike what's going on and asks if he was experiencing any similar issues, which Pike says he is. Spock asks Pike if he could go to the Admiral and force him to relinquish command. Pike agrees with Spock, as his science department had already come up with an idea that the peculiarities were caused by a problem with the universe, and says that he'll help Spock. McCoy shows Kirk the tape showing him as captain, and he tells McCoy that he'll give it to Spock, as Spock is busy meditating at the moment, trying to stave off the symptoms of Pon farr. Scott calls him to the bridge, as they have found a derelict Romulan vessel that had gotten separated from their mothership, and is requesting help. Spock agrees to bring the ship into their cargo base so they can help the Romulans. Spock takes them into custody, and later that night, Kirk is awoken by 2 Vulcan security officers, telling him he is to report to Captain Spock, along with Jerry. However, as Vulcans and Romulans share a common ancestor, they turned out to be Romulan spies, and they kidnapped Kirk and Jerry, taking them to some deserted planet to maroon them. Wait a minute. Romulans altering the timeline, Spock forcibly mind-melding with Kirk being a lower rank than everyone else and getting marooned on a planet far away from the ship. This book shares a lot of similarities with Star Trek 2009. I mean, the Praetor Thea even has a strong revenge connection with Spock. I don't know how to feel about this. Anyway, Thea tells Spock that he has to follow her if he ever wants to see Kirk alive again, and he complies, going with her to Romulus and posing as the Praetor. Spock agrees and takes McCoy as his slave, and Kirk and Jerry set up camp on the planet, trying to telepathically link up with Spock and Saparva, respectively, to give them their location. Spock takes Saparva with them as well, and they attempt to break into the Romulan computers, but without the central computer they can't do much. But with Saparva's mental powers, she can make it seem like both Saparva and McCoy are with Spock on a routine tour when it will only be McCoy, and she'll be free to find the central computer. McCoy, however, is worried about Spock as the Pon farr is progressing, and if he hasn't found someone to alleviate it, and if he doesn't, he'll die. Which we already knew because it was established in Amok time. Spock studies the tapes Saparva got during the tour and finds that the Romulans use the lightspeed breakaway factor to travel back, and so in order to reverse the damage, he needs a ship capable of making the trip. Spock goes to sleep and receives Kirk's message, as does Saparva, and they locate the planet that Kirk and Jerry are on, though without a ship they can't do much to rescue them. Spock's condition worsens as the Pon farr gets worse, and Thea tells McCoy that she can help, and despite his objections, he lets her work her magic, which is, well, Thea returns to Romulus and discovers the consequences of Second History, the raving madness, and goes to Spock, who tells her that they have a week to fix the timeline, but she doesn't want to as she is a failure in First History. Spock also says that they need to take Kirk with them as well. They go get Kirk and Jerry and prepare to travel to 2097, where a committee is laying the groundwork for something that would later become the United Federation of Planets. They rush in and save Dr. Palmer, but Jerry is killed and Spock is poisoned by the shot meant for Palmer, and he and Kirk wait out the time until the timeline shifts back to normal in each other's arms. Back on the Enterprise, McCoy tells Kirk that most of the strange dreams have stopped, and everything is mostly as it should be. Kirk finds a ring on the ground belonging to his counterpart, and he and Spock talk on their way way to the bridge, and Jerry shows up, everything as it should be. Kirk asks Spock if everything that happened in Second History was real, and surmises that there's an energy field connecting the two universes. So he leaves the ring where he found it, so that it can locate its true owner, and the story ends. And that was Star Trek Killing Time. Was it good? It definitely ranks among the best of Trek literature, in my opinion. It relies on a lot of callbacks, but they only enhance the story. And the alternate history is interesting, although I don't think it would have been quite the same if it had been done on TV. The writer has everyone down perfectly, and all the dialogue sounded completely natural reading it in Shatner's and Nimoy's voices. It's a lot like yesterday's Enterprise, actually, with it not being a bad alternate universe, but one that isn't right, and has the same moral dilemmas, except with there being the added issue that the universe will destroy itself if they don't change back. The alternate histories of Earth, Vulcan, and Romulus were interesting, and even the new characters like Jerry and Saparva fit right onto the Enterprise. While it obviously doesn't fit into established Trek canon, since its history of the United Federation of Planets is radically different than what we saw on Enterprise, it was an entertaining read, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And despite having all the controversial Kirk-Spock slash, it's harmless, and I really didn't notice it as much as I thought I would. So if that was keeping you away, I'd say give it a chance. I highly recommend it if you like Star Trek, alternate timelines, and very well-written dialogue. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the Literary Lair, you can hit that subscribe button, and if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. Next week, seeing as how this book was really similar to a certain unnumbered Star Trek movie, let's finally figure out how to fix that film. See you next time.